From inside the Banner offices along a snowy Inner Harbor, it is the Banner Ravens podcast. Paul Mancano and Jonas Shaffer. Jonas, we got a lot to talk about here on this podcast episode that we promised was going to come out yesterday, and then the snow up in Buffalo had other plans. That moved the game, and that moved our podcast back to today. But we are live on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Please give us a thumbs up, a like, a subscribe. Write us a good review if you can. If you write us a good review, we will read it out here on the podcast. We are going to be discussing the matchup that the Ravens have against the Texans in the divisional round on Saturday. We're also going to be talking about the potential return of their star tight end, Mark Andrews. And, of course, we're going to discuss the coordinator interviews that are going on. Todd Monken and Mike McDonald. We're going to debate which coordinator you would least like to lose to a head coaching job. All that and more coming up. But first, let's get a quick word from our sponsors.
If you have an appetite for saving money, then you should get the Rofo Rewards app from Royal Farms. Use the Rofo Rewards app to place mobile orders for pickup or delivery and earn royalty points to redeem for free stuff. And right now, new Rofo Rewards members will get a free any-size coffee for signing up. You can download the Rofo Rewards app at the Apple App Store or Google Play today. You'll find it's a very appealing app to have. Real fresh, real fast. Royal Farms.
The CIAA Men's and Women's Basketball Tournament is February 26th through March 3rd at CFG Bank Arena. Baltimore is bringing the hoops, the culture, and the energy. So grab your tickets now and book your hotel at baltimore.org/CIAA.
All right, Jonas, before we dive deep into this matchup between the Ravens and the Texans on Saturday at 4:30 at M&T Bank Stadium on ESPN/ABC, let's talk about the Ravens injury news, because you've been down at up in Owings Mills at practice. What is the latest on the numerous guys who have been missing practice as of late? Start with Zay Flowers, because that would be a massive loss if the Ravens are unable to go with him in the divisional round.
Yeah, leading receiver, obviously been a huge part of everything they do before the snap, after the snap. John Harbaugh was asked about him specifically on Monday. He said, we're pretty optimistic about everybody. So that would include Zay, obviously, then Marlon Humphrey, dealing with a calf injury. Dafe Owe missed all practice last week with the ankle injury. A couple nice rotational linebackers, Delshon Phillips, Malik Harrison also did not practice. So, obviously John said we'll know more once practice unfolds. Practice with the game being on Saturday has been moved up. We're going Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So we should have an injury report this afternoon. And, as long as none of those guys are missing, even if they're missing, Tuesday, if they're back Wednesday, I think all of those guys, it sounds like are there's optimism about them being ready to go. And obviously, I think the Ravens are still 9.5-point favorites, even with that injury uncertainty. So you want as much margin for error as possible. But even if those guys maybe aren't good to go for this week, you would think that next week, if they win, would be a sure shot.
Very similar line to the one that they faced against the Titans when they were 10-point favorites back in 2019.
Or in week one when they were 9.5-point favorites against the Texans and won comfortably.
And dominated 25-9. But the best injury news, Jonas, so far has been the return of Mark Andrews to Ravens practice. They opened his window on Friday, 21 days. What do you think the chances are that Mark Andrews comes back for this game or comes back for a potential AFC championship game or Super Bowl?
Well, the 3-week practice window, which opened on Friday, means that if they make it to the Super Bowl, he's coming back. That's a pretty clear indication, as you can imagine, because these guys aren't designated to return unless they have to. There's no deadline for them to be designated to return. So, Mark looked pretty good on Friday. Not like the Mark Andrews of old, still a little bit tender. That ankle is obviously going to need some work, going to need some TLC to get back to where it was. We don't even know if there's a chance that, he could be 100% by the end of the year. He's, to come back from not only the broken tibia, fibula, whatever it was, but also just the ligament damage. It's not insignificant, but everything that John Harbaugh told us about this recovery is that it's been ahead of schedule. And Mark Andrews is one of the hardest workers in that building. I'm sure he's doing whatever he can to put himself in a position. So even though I don't think it's especially likely that he'll play this weekend, you don't really need him with Isaiah Likely coming on strong, with Charlie Kohler giving you some nice snaps here and there. But, maybe if the Ravens advance to that AFC Championship game, maybe it's, closer to 50-50, whether he can give it a shot. And then obviously if they get to the Super Bowl, I think it's a near certainty that he would be good to go from that.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about this matchup now between the Ravens and the Texans. And Jonas, we were all sitting there dreaming about a matchup of Joe Flacco and the Browns coming back to Baltimore and M&T Bank Stadium. And then the Texans hit us with a harsh reality that they are the better team, that they are a better team than we have been expecting. We ranked the potential playoff opponents and potential divisional round opponents for the Ravens. We had the Texans dead last, as in we were least worried about the Texans. My concern level has gone up several notches about this Texans team because they absolutely dominated the Browns 45-14. And we were expecting, at least I was, at least one upset in the wild card round. And then it ended up looking like a president's NCAA tournament bracket because it was all chalk. Not a single upset in the AFC. And so we got all of the favorites moving on, and that includes the Texans. So they don't get the benefit of playing a worse seed in terms of the Steelers or the Dolphins or the Browns.
Were the Texans actually favored?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah.
The better seeds, I should say.
Yeah.
Making it to the next round. I mean, the Ravens do not get the benefit of having a lesser seed.
No.
So they get the number 4 seed, which is a pretty tough matchup.
Should we have a moment of silence here on air for all the Joe Flacco segments that never were?
Or even the segments that I used on previous podcasts to hype it up, because I look back at our Instagram feed, and you should follow us on Instagram. I think it's Balt Banner Sports. And I had a clip about how it just feels like destiny that Joe Flacco was going to come in. And then you see 3 posts later, it's Joe. Joe Flacco has been eliminated and the Browns are out.
A lot of people talking themselves into this whole destiny notion with Joe Flacco.
Myself included.
It's fine. It's fine. Everyone loves a good storyline. I personally, I'm fine with us talking about a fresh new team rather than a Browns team that we've seen twice already and rehashing everything that was going to be rehashed with Joe Flacco. But yeah, this is just like that Browns team, not as good as we thought. This Texans team, better than we thought.
Yeah.
Certainly a higher ceiling than the Texans team that came into Baltimore in week 1 and was fine, but it's clearly a step below. Shout out to John Harbaugh saying after that game, after the Ravens won 22-9, that this was 25-9, that this was a Texans team that would win a lot of games this year. And he was right, despite missing CJ Stroud for a couple games this year with concussion, despite having so many young guys and this first year staff under D'Amico Ryans, they're frisky, man. They can hang with the best of them.
Yeah. When we saw that team in week 1, we were very much expecting a team much closer to the 2022 Texans, which were not a very good football team, a team that ended up with that number 2 overall pick. And then they traded back up for Will Anderson. But D'Amico Ryans and CJ Stroud have completely revitalized that franchise, a franchise that you look, 24 months ago and was still dealing with the Deshaun Watson saga. And they're able to turn the page so quickly. But Jonas, even on our last podcast, we were discussing this team and saying they're just kind of middle of the road offensively and defensively. Were we looking at it wrong? Should we have been saying there's no clear weakness for this team? Because I watched that game against the Browns, and both offensively and defensively, it just felt like they had answers for everything that the Browns were throwing at them.
Did they have answers on defense, or did Joe Flacco just become a 38-year-old quarterback and Amari Cooper just start to get start playing on a blown tire there?
But Joe Flacco was
fourth or fifth string offensive tackles.
He was torching defenses in the final 5 weeks of the regular season.
Yeah. I just think the Texans' passing offense very, very good. Rushing offense, The Texans' run defense very, very good. Texans' passing defense, I don't know.
2 pick sixes.
But they put themselves in a spot on Saturday where the game script completely favored them. They didn't have to run the ball because they were just passing all over the yard. Cleveland just would refuse to do anything but blitz CJ Stroud, and he made them pay for it every single time. And there was no effectiveness to that Cleveland passing game because they were trying to do it on 2nd and 8s and 3rd and 10s, and it just wasn't happening. So I think if a game is a lot closer, then you start to see some of those weaknesses magnified for Houston. But in all 3 phases of this game, offense, defense, special teams, on paper, the Ravens are at least a step or 2 above.
Yeah, it is, however, a different team than the team that the Ravens faced back in week 1. And both of these teams are very different teams. I think that's a fascinating matchup because it has been so long since these two teams met. And we went back and watched that week 1 game to see exactly what has changed about this Texans team and whether the signs were there all along. And both of these teams have just radically changed over the course of the season. Of course, that was a 25-9 Ravens win. The Ravens, remember, came into that game without Mark Andrews, and they could very well be without Mark Andrews in the divisional round. They were still had some guys working their way back. Rashad Bateman, OBJ, still getting back to full strength. Keaton Mitchell at that point was on IR, and so he will miss both of these matchups. And on the other side of the ball, the Texans had a very different offensive line combination than the one that they have now. It was just a different time for both of those teams. And we were seeing the very beginning of the Todd Monken offense, what was going to work, what wasn't. Lamar was still getting on the same page with his wide receivers. And on the other side, CJ Stroud was making his first career start. And you saw the natural struggles that you would see from a rookie. But if you're watching closely, I think you could see, it was kind of like a Rorschach test. You could see the struggles that he was going to go through, but you could also see the signs of the very good quarterback that he has become this season.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't throw any interceptions despite dropping back and passing a few dozen times. I mean, that was a situation where he couldn't do anything but drop back and pass basically every single snap in the second half, especially when the Ravens went up double digits. And that became a theme for the Texans in this season. I think CJ Stroud led the NFL in touchdown to interception ratio. So there were a couple of dicey throws there against the Ravens that maybe should have been picked off, but also, like you said, a couple of really nice just dots, throwing to the sideline with anticipation, throwing over the middle to Nico Collins, who, had his first of many really nice games against the Ravens. I think went over 1,300 yards this season. So there was a lot of stuff that was going against CJ Stroud in that one. I think notable that the Texans averaged 3rd and 9.2 yards to go, just putting themselves in positions where it was very, very hard to succeed. They went forward on 4th down a couple times, did not have any luck. He was sacked once. They stuffed Dameon Pierce on another 4th and 1 near midfield. So there were opportunities for Houston to put themselves into scoring position. But because of where the Ravens defense was and because of where this Houston offensive line especially was, just not a lot of joy in those drives.
I do think, though, that the Texans offense now is better than it was. I know they will be missing Tank Dell,
and Noah Brown.
Tank Dell going out for the season, I believe with a broken fibula about a month ago. He was in that matchup. He was playing in his first game as well, along with CJ Stroud. So the Texans will be without 2 of their better pass catchers in Brown and Dell. However, that offensive line that I mentioned, they were starting a 6th-round rookie at center in Jarrett Patterson. He ended up fracturing his fibula in October. Juice Scruggs, who was their 2nd-round tackle from a year ago, was out in that game. He's now starting at guard. Titus Howard was out of that game as well. He came back midseason and then went back onto the IR with a different injury. So it's a different offensive line. And the change at running back is also interesting. You mentioned Dameon Pierce. He was their starting running back at the beginning of the season. And right around October, end of October, beginning of November, they made the switch to start giving Devin Singletary more carries. And it has worked to their advantage. Dameon Pierce was really finding nothing. He had a very good rookie year last year, but this year just totally regressed. And I think the switch to Devin Singletary has helped their running game a lot. We saw him pop off for 60-some yards against the Browns. I know he's not a huge part of their offense, and they're still going to rely probably heavily on CJ Stroud. But I think that this offense is more well-rounded than the one the Ravens faced in week 1.
Yeah, and Dameon Pierce, as far as I can recall, not a great receiving option. But you look at what Devin Singletary's done for Houston, 30 catches, 193 yards, no touchdowns, but just another option for CJ Stroud to find. And I think that's what, this Texans offense has just needed. It's big guys to catch the ball reliably. This is a Bobby Slowick offense, so it's a Shanahan offense. A lot of the layups and easy completions that you see in San Francisco, in Miami, in LA with the Rams. Obviously, CJ Stroud is a ball player. I mean, he's making a lot of really tough throws, but with what they do with motion, with what they do with play action, bootlegs, he can get some nice completions and put some guys in space. And you saw just how much hell the Texans had Cleveland on a bunch of those busted plays downfield on Saturday. So it'll be on the Ravens to be on their P's and Q's. The Ravens may be the best team in the NFL against motion. We saw that down the stretch. Just everything aside from a couple stretches here and there, like on that long touchdown pass in the Jacksonville game, really buttoned up against motion. And then I think this Texans offense does not have the ceiling that the 49ers do, that the Rams do, maybe even the Jaguars did. So I think the Ravens should be well prepared because of that familiarity with the kind of offensive DNA. But still, Nico Collins is a beast. CJ Stroud is a beast. Dalton Schultz had a nice game with that 30-plus yard touchdown. So the Ravens cannot take this group lightly.
Yeah, you mentioned the Rams and the 49ers, both teams that the Ravens did beat, and both, like you said, Shanahan-style offenses coming from that coaching tree. PQ needs to be on his P's and Q's as well. Just had to throw that out there. Defensively, I think this Texans defense is a little bit better than the one that the Ravens faced in week 1 as well. They got 4 sacks on Lamar in week 1. Then they went a stretch where they did not have a sack in 3 of their next 4 games. They figured it out midway through the season, and they started sacking quarterbacks at a rate better than the rate that the Ravens did. 3.4 sacks per game from their last 11 games of the regular season. The Ravens, for the entire year, 3.3 sacks per game, and of course led the NFL in that category. Jonathan Grenard, who did have a sack in that week 1 game, finished with 12.5 sacks. Rookie Will Anderson had 6 pressures and a sack. He has been phenomenal for them. Absolutely worth the trade back up in the beginning of the 2023 NFL draft. They are both dealing with injuries, however, but this is a very impressive front 7 that the Ravens will be facing in Texas.
Yeah, and one guy you didn't mention who was missing that first game in Baltimore was Blake Cashman. Nice linebacker. I think he led the team in tackles. He's back for this one. He's obviously a focal point of that run defense, but I don't think we can spend too much time talking about the injuries to Will Anderson and Jonathan Grenard, because Will Anderson, I think he played only about 55% of those defensive snaps against Cleveland. I think Grenard was at like 25%. Both those guys were dealing with ankle injuries. Ankle injuries do not typically get all that much better when you go through a game like that, especially with just a week's rest. Not a lot of hope, I think, for them just suddenly finding some magic elixir to get into the kind of shape that they were in week 1. And Will Anderson, at points in that week 1 game looked like the best defensive player on the field. I mean, he was juking by Ronnie Stanley. He was, putting Kevin Zeitler in all kinds of trouble when he was rushing from the interior. Just a really, really impressive guy. And he's also a tremendous run defender. That was for as many sacks as he racked up at Alabama. He was also a really, really important piece of what they did run defense wise. And so if you take him off the field, if Grenard is not totally healthy, then maybe that run defense, which has been really, really good all year, becomes a little bit more vulnerable. And that obviously makes the play action passing game and the deep drops and everything more viable. And, the Ravens have been able to deal with defenses that have only a good run defense and a bad pass defense. They've been able to deal with the opposite. So if they can take advantage of these injuries and really take it to this Houston defense that has given up a lot of explosive plays this year, then I think they should feel pretty good about where their offense is, especially relative to week 1.
So watching it back, Jonas, do you think that this is a much better Texans team, or do you think that things have just kind of broken their way over the last several weeks of the season? They had kind of an easier end of the regular season. You could make a case one way or the other about the Browns as a quality opponent. They were playing at home in the divisional round. I mean, I see improvement across the board for some of their key players, and especially CJ Stroud, watching his development throughout the course of the season. But, I also don't want to go off one game sample size and say they put up 45 points on the Browns.
Yeah.
This is a completely revamped team. I think maybe there's a little bit of both. What do you think?
I'm kind of torn because it wasn't like there was this slow and steady ascent for CJ Stroud. I mean, I think in week
slow steady ascent for CJ Stroud.
You got me there.
Yeah.
Because in week 2, I think CJ Stroud went for almost 400 yards. It wasn't like there was this figuring out process. It was just like he went against a really good Ravens defense in week 1 with a really bad offensive line. And this Texans offensive line still not great. I think PFF had them like 16th in the NFL at the end of season. Now they have fewer weapons. So, yeah, I mean, they have definitely gotten better because every team gets better. But the Ravens have gotten a lot better. We weren't
every team but the Eagles. Yeah.
It's just a matter of like them figuring out what they do best.
Right.
I think putting guys in positions to succeed, figuring out what works schematically for them, what doesn't work schematically for them. I'm sure there's wrinkles of this playbook that would be different for the Ravens to prepare for. It's not like the Ravens are going from playing the Steelers in week 18 to playing the Steelers in the divisional round. It is a much different, much more evolved, passing attack and probably running attack too, with Dameon Pierce not being the bell cow back. So obviously the Ravens have to prepare for this. They've been preparing for it since Saturday, basically. That's the nice part of them playing as early as they did. Texans will have 2 fewer days to get ready. Or I guess I shouldn't say that. They'll have the regular week of rest. But yeah, I mean, they've gotten better, but so have the Ravens.
Yeah. John Harbaugh started his press conference yesterday by talking about how they were already preparing for the Texans. And we're going to have to pivot if the Steelers won that game. And things got a little bit dicey near the end, but ultimately their game plans for the Texans are intact. And that was not pointless research that they did on their opponent. All right, Paul Mancano and Jonas Shaffer here on the Banner Ravens podcast. And Jonas, we talked a little bit about how Bobby Slowick could be, has revitalized that Houston Texans offense, and he could be a potential head coaching candidate. Let's talk about some of the head coaching candidates that are currently on the Ravens coaching staff. We talked about it a little bit last week, but Mike Macdonald and Todd Monken, both of these guys are getting interview requests around the NFL. Mike Macdonald, so far, we have seen 5 teams, and now reportedly 6 with the Seahawks could be interviewing with. Todd Monken, 2 in the Panthers and the Chargers. Macdonald, the Commanders, the Panthers, the Titans, the Falcons, the Chargers, and reportedly the Seahawks. A wild coaching cycle. Just the number of top-tier candidates available. Maybe the best head coach of all time is available. And then you've got, very good other head coaching candidates like Mike Vrabel out there, and some very good openings as well. But between these 2 coordinators that the Ravens have, I want to have a discussion about which one you would least like to lose if you are the Ravens, because you could make cases for the contributions of both of these coordinators. Let's start with Mike Macdonald, because he was already getting discussed in circles last year about him being a potential future head coach. He's still not 40 years old. He is viewed as kind of a wonder kid in defensive circles. He has turned this defense into a defense that won the Triple Crown, which isn't really even a thing. Leading the league in, I had never heard of it before this season.
I think I made it up.
Did you make it up? All right. That's fair.
There are a lot of possible Triple Crowns when you just combine stats.
Yeah, exactly. On the BaltimoreBanner.com, where you can subscribe $1 for 6 months. Jonas wrote about how the defense led the league in scoring, sacks, and takeaways. He's gotten the most out of his top players. He has developed a lot of young players, and he's getting resurgent seasons from a lot of veterans. He has checked every single box for the Ravens defense this season.
Yeah, and there is, I guess, optimism that he could stay because of what you just mentioned. Where is he in line behind the Bill Belichick's, behind maybe the Pete Carrolls, behind Mike Vrabel's? That there is no track record yet of him being a culture builder. Not that he is not beloved in that room. There's a lot of guys who would absolutely go to war for Mike Macdonald, but yeah, I mean, he's been extremely instrumental to what the Ravens have done. Basically since Roquan Smith got to Baltimore, they've had the number 1 or number 2 defense in the NFL and so many unbelievable metrics. So he's been, a glove in hand fit for John Harbaugh and this team and the staff, and his success, and I think has enabled John Harbaugh to be a little bit more flexible, a little bit more pliable in some of his philosophies. We saw John Harbaugh go from a blitz crazy guy in Wink Martindale to a dude in Mike Macdonald who's comfortable throwing you a couple curveballs, a couple sliders, not really delivering the fast stuff every single time, throwing down the pipe, and it's worked. It's worked in a lot of ways better than it ever did under Wink Martindale. So what he's done has been amazing. Obviously, there's been a lot of investment on that side of the ball, like there always is with the Ravens, but he's done a great job. And if they were to lose him, it would be a substantial blow.
Yeah, and then Todd Monken on the offensive side. Ravens lead the NFL in rushing yards despite not having a 1K rusher. They have gotten a career year out of Lamar Jackson despite not having a 1,000-yard receiver. And I think the case for Todd Monken's impact begins and ends with the kind of season that we've seen from Lamar Jackson, hitting a career high in passing yards, still leading all quarterbacks in rushing yards, over 800 in that way, probably going to win his second MVP. And when you have an offensive coordinator with a newly minted quarterback who just signed a $260 million contract, you want him to get the most out of your quarterback. That is priority number one. And Todd Monken absolutely delivered this year.
Yeah, and I think that's why, for me, and we can argue about which one would be more devastating for the Ravens to lose. I think that's why, for as good as Mike Macdonald has been, you want Todd Monken to stay here, because, there is that chance to build on it. It's like, you hear all the time in college football about the 5-star quarterback at the, big time blue blood program who's had to deal with one offensive coordinator change after another, or the, top 3 quarterback pick who's, ends up in Washington or Arizona or some, NFL backwater, and just cannot seem to get any kind of, bearing on where he is in the NFL, because every single year there is churn and turnover at that offensive coordinator position. Now, obviously Lamar is built different, because in 2019 won an MVP with Greg Roman in kind of sort of their first year together calling plays. I mean, that was Greg Roman's rushing off in 2018 that helped carry the Ravens to the playoffs. But, Greg Roman leaves, Todd Monken comes in, again, first year, in all likelihood, he's going to be the MVP. So maybe a little bit of a market inefficiency there where, for as much as you are trying to catch up to the nuances of this offense, so are defenses trying to figure out exactly what your ingredients are. But I still think it's not just the Lamar factor. It's everyone being comfortable with what he wants, hitting those landmarks as a receiver, understanding the reads as a running back, getting to certain depths as an offensive lineman. And just, there is that chance for Todd Monken to iterate. I mean, the second and third year Georgia offenses were a lot better than the first year offenses. And obviously a lot of that had to do with Stetson Bennett maturing and becoming a far more capable passer and leader. But I think you would expect the same for Lamar. There's obviously areas where he can improve in, not just as a passer, but as a ball carrier, as a pre-snap guy. And I think for the Ravens to lose Todd Monken after 1 year of a pretty perfect partnership between play caller and quarterback, I think would definitely be a setback.
And you obviously see more offensive-minded head coaches around the NFL than you do defensive-minded head coaches. So it is so difficult to find those guys, offensive coordinators, who are going to be in your building for a long time. So if you can get your offensive coordinator who has already had that much success to come back, that is hugely helpful, because there is just such a dearth of great offensive minds coming up sometimes because they get poached so quickly. So let's say Todd Monken does get hired by another team. You are then having to search lower ranks for passing game coordinators or quarterbacks coaches or wide receivers coaches in order to find the next good offensive mind. And best case scenario is he brings out another great year in Lamar Jackson and then gets hired by another team as a head coach. So it's a constant churn and a constant turnover in that department. That is, I think, another concern of why you would be worried about that. There's just no guarantee that if you bring in some young offensive mind, maybe you go through the college ranks and try to find, another Joe Brady that was supposed to be the next big thing, there's no guarantee that that guy is going to get on the same page with Lamar that quickly and be able to figure things out that quickly and, that early in his tenure. Whereas Todd Monken, if you're bringing him back, you already know that you have that chemistry. So that would be certainly an area of concern if you lose Todd Monken. For Mike Macdonald, though, you could make a case that he is one of the best, if not the best, has been defensive coordinator in the NFL in 2023. And I know he has had phenomenal personnel. And you mentioned the investment that the Ravens have made in that side of the ball, has been phenomenal. And they have gotten some really top end players, but he has just gotten the most out of every single level of that defense. I mean, I think Kyle Hamilton and a lot of other defenses put in the hands of a lot of other defensive coordinators is not the all-pro that he is in Baltimore.
Right.
He is getting misused, I think, by people. I think, some people would like to make him just a safety. Some people would try to move him to slot cornerback full-time. And the way that Mike Macdonald has been able to utilize him as a Swiss Army knife has gotten the absolute most out of him. You look at the older guys, the veterans that they brought in who are having career years. I mean, Jadeveon Clowney was being viewed as, maybe an overpay at $10 million by the Ravens, more of a run stuffer, we were saying at the beginning of the season, than somebody who could still consistently get after the quarterback.
Right.
He is having a phenomenal year. Justin Madubuike, 13 sacks, having a career year, going to cash in free agency. Patrick Queen, who his first couple years in the NFL were rough in a lot of statistical categories. They pair him with Roquan Smith, and Roquan has a lot to do with that. And the players themselves have a lot to do with that as well. The work that obviously that
and
they
the
do.
assistant coaches too.
Yeah, and the assistant coaches, the staff has a lot to do with that. But every single player in this defense has been maximized. You wonder what this defense would look like next year if they lose Queen, if they lose Madubuike, but you just cannot argue with the impact that Mike Macdonald has had on that side of the ball.
Yeah, I guess if I were to play devil's advocate, and it's so tough when you're talking about variability and volatility on offense versus defense, because to your point, when you have a quarterback and or a Shanahan-esque play caller who is just a golden child, there is a lot more consistency. There's a lot more steadiness at the reins. Defense is a lot more volatile. You can count on Patrick Mahomes to be a top 3 quarterback every year, and the stats will reflect that. Roquan Smith could have a good year next year as opposed to a great year, and that defense could fall from top 1 to top 10. It's just as simple as that. There is no one who has the control over a defense on the field the way that a quarterback does on offense.
Yeah.
And for that reason, you see really talented defenses just kind of fall apart sometimes, or just fall into the middle of the pack despite having a lot of really good talent. I guess that my argument for why Monken would be preferable to keeping Macdonald is, let's say the Ravens find a way to keep Justin Madubuike. You were talking about whoever would take over that defense would have Kyle Hamilton, Madubuike, Roquan Smith, Marlon Humphrey, a healthy Marcus Williams, Brandon Stevens entering year 4, Michael Pierce, Roderick Washington, a lot of really talented guys. And, just because you have all the ingredients doesn't mean you're going to be a gourmet chef. It's just as simple as that. But that would be a really, really nice place to start for whoever would possibly come in and take over.
Yeah, and then you see on the offensive side, you are potentially losing in free agency Odell Beckham Jr. Rashad Bateman is coming back for next year for year 4, but they did not pick up his 5th-year option, and he has not had a great season. Nelson Aguilar is a free agent. You are losing some key pieces on offense.
Kevin Zeitler.
Yeah, J.K. Dobbins.
John Simpson.
Yeah, Gus Edwards. So a lot of offensive turnover could be coming this offseason. And you would want somebody experienced at the reins to be able to handle that, and somebody who already has experience with Lamar Jackson working with maybe a new group of weapons again next season. So I understand it from that perspective.
Right.
I honestly think I pick Macdonald in this instance because I just think he is a better defensive coordinator than Todd Monken is an offensive coordinator.
Yep.
However, it's pretty much a toss-up in my mind. And you don't want the Ravens to lose either one of these guys just because of the continuity factor, just because of the great thing that they have already built here. I think losing both would be a doomsday scenario. I mean, we saw it in Philadelphia. They lost both of their coordinators, and the kind of turnover and the regression that they have seen this year has been massive. You just don't want to lose that kind of continuity from last year to this year.
Yeah, and there's a chance that both come back. I mean, obviously,
Right.
Todd Monken, 2 offensive coordinator, 2 head coaching interviews, or 2 more than we'll ever get. So,
I don't know.
I really like
you
the
like your
offense
stats.
I like the offensive stuff that you've been drawing up in your spare time.
Thank you. Yeah.
But probably not at the top of anyone's coaching list yet. And you look at Detroit and the success that they've had with Ben Johnson, their offensive coordinator. He was Mr. Hot Ticket item at the end of last year, and he just straight up declined a couple of head coaching interviews because he wanted to wait it out, get a couple more, get some more seasoning, get a better list of potential candidates who would be after him. And I guess the smoke is on him possibly going to DC, and that would be a nice spot for him because of the quarterback situation and the new ownership and all the salary cap space. I don't know if Mike Macdonald, if he gets an offer, let's say it's from Carolina. I think we talked about this a week ago or two. Like, do you want to go to Carolina, or would you rather take your time and wait out a spot for next year, knowing that you're probably going to get interest, knowing that it's probably going to be a more favorable coaching cycle, and you don't have to deal with Bryce Young and all the cultural problems that are there with the Panthers and David Tepper and everything like that. So, Mike Macdonald can afford to be picky. I think what he's put on tape for the past 2 years and all the reviews around the league about this guy being a really good leader of men in the mold of John Harbaugh are going to give his coaching stock, legs for years, basically.
You are still taking a risk, and we've talked about this on previous podcasts. I know, they could be starting, even if they lose, Manabike or Queen, they are starting with again next year, another solid foundation of defense. However, you are then, like you said, defense is so not sticky year to year.
Yep.
If this unit then drops out of the top 5 and maybe is the 10th, 12th best defense in the NFL next year, maybe teams say, hold on, let's cool it with the Mike Macdonald talk. Maybe he's not the defensive coordinator that we thought he was. Fascinating discussion, and one that, again, we will have to put on the back burner as we await the results of the playoffs and the divisional round between the Ravens and the Texans. We will have complete coverage for you on the BaltimoreBanner.com. You can follow Jonas on Twitter at Jonas_Shaffer. I am at Paul Mancano. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Please like, review, rate, subscribe, give us a thumbs up on YouTube. Anywhere that you get your podcast, you can get the Banner Ravens podcast. For Jonas Shaffer, I'm Paul Mancano.